words modern and modernity a lot in anthropology and sociology. I mean, we use them all the time. Questions about the essential nature of modernity and modern social change are some of the most widely studied issues in the social sciences today. Yet, they are also kind of slippery terms that are hard to pin down, and which tend to be used rather carelessly, which can cause some real confusion. So I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about what we mean by them. Now, the word modern goes a lot further back than you might think it does. It comes from a Latin adjective, modernus, which sort of means just now. And people have been using it that way for a long time. Back in the 400s, Christian writers used modern to distinguish their own Christian society from the pagan societies in Rome that preceded it. The word moved into Middle French in the 1400s, and by the 1500s, Shakespeare was using it just to mean ordinary. A modern thing is just what you see around you. All of which means that for a very long time, people have been using the word modern to refer to cultures that today we would call really old-fashioned. Now, in the social sciences, and also in philosophy, talking about the modern period, or modernity, means something a little more specific. It refers to a particular period in human history, one that starts out in the Renaissance and proceeds right on up through the late 20th century. Now, people sometimes divide it up. They'll talk about early modernity, referring to the period from around 1500 on up until the French Revolution in 1789. Then there's classical modernity, referring to the period from 1789 right up to about the First World War. And then late modernity, referring to the period from the First World War right on up to the end of the 20th century. You will also often hear about something called postmodernity, or the postmodern period. That's used even more vaguely than modernity. Some people talk about that as going from about 1990 to the present, while others talk about it more as an approach to the world than as a historical period. All of those dates and terms, however, are pretty fuzzy. And I don't think there's any agreement about the idea that you can date phases of modernity the way you can date presidential administrations. The problem with modernity is that we're kind of in the middle of it, and it's always hard to describe something that you're right in the middle of. Perhaps the best way to define modernity or modern culture is that it's the kind of social and cultural organization that you find in much of the contemporary world. A model of cultural organization that was first found in Western Europe, starting in the 1700s, and which has steadily spread around the world since then. It can be hard to pin down just what that model is, but intuitively it seems undeniable that it represents a real break from the cultural forms that went before it. Just to give you a sense of that, think about Paul Revere. I don't know if you folks still learn about Paul Revere in school. He was a Boston silversmith who became one of the foremost leaders of the American Revolutionary Movement in the 1770s. He is most famous for his midnight ride on the 18th of April in 1775, when he rode through the countryside around Boston to tell everyone that the British regulars were launching an attack. And he is still sort of a hero in Massachusetts. I was reading a biography about him recently, and one of the points that the author made was how much different his America was from ours. When Paul Revere lived there in the 1700s, Boston was really just a small town. Most of the people in Massachusetts lived on farms, and those farms were cultivated pretty much the way that European farms had been cultivated for 1,000 years. Revere had to make his midnight ride to Lexington because there were no telephones to call there. For that matter, there were none of the technologies that we take for granted. Things like refrigerators, or electric lights, or automobiles. There was no Social Security Administration. There were no universities as we think of them. There were no income taxes. If Paul Revere had hopped into a time machine and gone 500 years back to England in 1275, he would have found a lot of differences, but he would still have understood basically how the society worked. He could have gotten around, he could have gotten a job, he could have functioned there in the society. If he had gone 200 years forward, by contrast, to 1975, he would have been utterly lost and completely bewildered. Something happened during that time. A kind of change in society and culture that many people argue was almost unprecedented in human history. That change is what we're thinking of when we talk about the rise of modernity. Now, as I say, modernity is a hard thing to define, but there are a number of things that pretty much everyone agrees are associated with it. One, for example, is the rise of industry, especially the rise of industries involving mass production. People have been making products for sale for thousands of years, and they've had standardized ways of doing that for a very long time. It wasn't until the early 1800s, though, that really standardized mass production came into existence. Mass production, in this sense, means the use of machines and artificial power to create standardized products that require relatively little specialized expertise from the workers who operate them. At the beginning of the 19th century, mechanized factories were developed, and what they needed for them was really for military uses. Factories in England were developed to craft block and tackle sets to support the massive expansion of the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. By the middle of the 1800s, gun manufacturers in the United States had figured out how to craft truly interchangeable parts for the first time, allowing mass-produced goods, what was called the American system of production, to be distributed and used much more widely than they had been. In the early 20th century, the Ford Motor Company advanced this still further by developing the first true assembly lines, which allowed workers to specialize on manufacturing individual tasks in a way that sped up production and reduced manufacturing errors tremendously. Over the course of the 20th century, the use of electrical power and increasingly sophisticated tools led to industrial production of extraordinary speed and efficiency and, above all, standardization, to the point where the vast majority of goods that Western individuals come into contact with are now the products of mass production. It's hard to overstate what a huge change this is, both in the way that people relate to objects and in the way that people work. The objects, for example. Look around you. If you're in a typical American home or a typical American dorm room, it will be hard to pick out more than a few objects in your sight that weren't made through a manufacturing process. Your furniture, your dishes, your lights, the frames around your pictures, your pens and pencils, your clothes, your food. How much of it was made by a single person working for him or herself? Any of it? The odds are that most of what you have around you was made in a factory someplace. Where? Who made it? In what country? In what city? What language did they speak? How much did they get paid for creating it? How do they spend their wages? The odds are very strong that you don't know any of that. You couldn't know any of that even if you tried. For you, these are just objects, separate from anything about the people who created them. Now, we take that for granted, but of course that's something very new in human culture. Remember back when we were talking about the Kung San and the rule of arrows? For the Kung San, the objects they used to go hunting were objects that they and the people around them had created, and every one was stamped in some way with the identity of its creator. Everyone was different. Everyone was personal. That has been the human experience for the overwhelming part of the history of human beings. Even in pre-modern Europe, even in the rural United States before the Civil War, most of the things that people used were either made by themselves or by an artisan that they could identify. And that means that their belongings had a personality. They had an identity. Your physical environment was something meaningful, something personal, something connected very closely with your social world and with your family. It was also connected with your culture. There was a different way that people in every area, every region, made things like houses and furniture and clothing and religious artifacts. It would be almost literally impossible to have an experience that we have all the time, right? Say you travel from your home to someplace on the other side of the country, and you check into a hotel room in the chain hotel. That hotel room will look exactly like the hotel rooms in your town, right? That couldn't have happened before the modern period. The rise of mass production has meant the standardization of culture, a depersonalization of the physical world that we live in, the decline of the rich material cultures that defined individual homes and villages from the rise of Homo sapiens until just a couple of centuries ago. Now, mass production also implies a different kind of economic organization in society. Factories are huge places, often employing hundreds or thousands of people, and they require enormous amounts of capital to build and to operate. That means that you have to have social structures that allow the concentration of huge amounts of wealth in a few hands, as well as systems of authority and control that can force people to follow complex and systematic rules. You also have to have things like standard ideas about time and space and movement. Clocks didn't used to be important things in human society. Reliable ones were only invented a few hundred years ago, and they weren't common in individual homes until the 19th century. For the most part, nobody needed to have them, right? The tasks people did during the day didn't have to be synchronized with large numbers of people. And whether you started planting your crop at 5 minutes before noon or 20 minutes after noon really didn't make a whole lot of difference. In pre-modern Europe and in the early United States, they'd often have a central clock in the town hall or on a church to give people a general idea of what time it was, but they weren't particularly accurate. The clock in one town wasn't synchronized with the clock in a town 20 miles away, and there was certainly nothing approaching the idea of time zones, because again, why would you need there to be? Time was something local. Time was something vague. Time didn't need to be standardized. That changed with the rise of railroads in the 19th century. In order to have an efficient railroad network, you needed to be able to tell when particular trains were going to stop at particular stations. And for that, you needed a general agreement on what time it was. Now, that accelerated with the rise of mass production, when you need all the workers to start their work at the same time, and you need for different tasks to be timed out so they can all fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. As technology has gotten more developed, the need for synchronization has gotten more and more precise, to the point where in the United States today, almost everyone is carrying a cell phone that is synchronized to exactly the same time, down to tenths of a second. That's just one example of the enormous shift in human consciousness that's taken place as a result of industrialization and mass production. We tend to think about factories in terms of the profits they generate, and the materials they consume and the things they create, but their real impact is much greater than that. Manufacturing doesn't just change how we produce things, it changes the nature of the culture and the consciousness within which we exist. Now, another change associated with modernization is the rise of bureaucracy, the tendency for our world to be regulated and governed by the rules of large organizations rather than the dictates of small-scale groups and families, neighborhoods, villages, that kind of thing. Some of those bureaucracies are political, like the United States government, or the government of the state of New York, or the government of Clinton County, or the city of Plattsburgh. Others involve government administration, like the Social Security Administration, or the IRS, or the military. Still others are corporate and economic. Your daily life is tied in with organizations like your bank, your internet service provider, your phone provider, your health insurance provider, your health club, your auto insurance provider, not to mention, of course, the kind and benevolent administrators at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh. Again, this is all something profoundly new. For most of human history, nobody outside your family and your neighborhood had any idea who you were or what you did on a daily basis. Even if you lived in a state society like Imperial China or the Holy Roman Empire, the state and its bureaucracy was normally something pretty far away from you. Human life occurred primarily face to face, and what mattered to you was the people around you, not abstract rules and faceless institutions. In modern culture, all of that is displaced by an increasingly omnipresent complex of bureaucracies. Now, some other functions or features of the modern period include things like the rise of mass communication, in which news and information can travel very fast over great distances. The rise of travel, not only travel of people, but travel of goods, moving things from one end of the world to another in a matter of days or weeks. Rapid technological development, with an expectation that every generation is going to experience a substantially different technological world than the one before it. And also what's sometimes called rationalization, a tendency to organize social life increasingly along rational and scientific principles. Taken all together, modernity represents a really fundamental change in what it means to live in human society. Having said that, I should emphasize two things as well. The first thing is that there is a lot of disagreement among scholars about just what modernity is and how it works. As I said, it's really hard to get a sense of what something is when you're standing inside of it. And as a result, people looking at the modern world tend to characterize it in different ways. One good example of that is the process of secularization. Secularization refers to a process by which the authority of religion is gradually displaced from the public sphere in modern society. You know, in the year 1400, literally every government in Europe was associated with a specific state religion. Today, there are only a few state churches left in Europe, and most of those don't have much authority. You don't have to belong to a specific religion in order to run for office, or purchase a car, or work as a doctor in most modern societies. That's what we call the process of secularization. Now, for a long time, social scientists looked at this process in terms of belief. They argued that the rise of science and rationality tended to discredit religion, so that over time, religion would erode and disappear altogether in modern society. Now, personally, I never thought that made much sense. If religion has been one of the most important features of human culture for as far back as we can trace human culture, it probably answers needs that aren't simply going to disappear in the modern era. And the idea that science somehow discredits religion relies on a very limited idea of what religion is. But still, the idea that modernity meant the disappearance of religion was taken almost as an article of faith in the social sciences right on up into the early 1980s. Then, of course, religion struck back. You had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the rise of fundamentalist Christianity in the United States, the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, and a whole range of religious resurgences across the modern world. Suddenly, the old association of secularism and modernity didn't seem so obvious. Now, on a broader level, it's not just secularism. There's a lot of disagreement about just what modernity involves and what it includes. And so if you look in different books, you'll find it defined in different ways by different people. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you shouldn't overstate the contrast between the modern and the pre-modern world. I've made the argument over the past few minutes that modernity represents a real transformation of human culture, and I do think that's true. But there are people, like my friend Richard Blanton at Purdue University, who take a different view. They see a lot more continuity between the two, arguing that some of the things that we associate from modernity have actually been around for quite a long time. Local cultures, they point out, were always influenced to some degree by larger regional structures. And things like trade and long-distance communication have always existed to some extent. It may well be that they're right, that modern and pre-modern societies aren't quite as different as I think they are. They may be, rather than two fundamentally different things, but rather two ideal types that exist along a continuum. Either way, though, I think all of us can agree on the general shape of modern society and to some of the challenges that it presents to traditional human culture and traditional human notions of the self.